question. There's the question of whether her canonization would serve some sort of agenda of the bishops, and that is distant or foreign to what her priorities were. Again, I find that is not an unreasonable concern. It was a concern that I felt very much as I watched through the miracle of live streaming the bishop's discussion of this question when Cardinal Dolan proposed it. And one by one to hear bishops get up and almost sort of be making like a claim, like, you know, she did live in Chicago for a while, so we are mighty interested in this. And like our native daughter or something. Well, she was in New Orleans too, don't forget about that. And there was California, and so the idea that she's like a New York saint. I think that there was a certain amount of that kind of spirit that might have animated some of the earlier discussion in the diocese about the prospect of making her a saint. Why not add her to the list of great New Yorkers, Fulton Sheen and Pierre Toussaint and whatever. So in other words, what she actually stood for, her message, maybe not so important as the fact that she lived here and she's ours. She's a great Catholic. I also was disedified to hear a lot of discussion about how if Dorothy were around here, we could really use her support for the Fortnight of Freedom and the defense of religious liberty and the pro-life message as it is sort of defined by the American bishops. So in that context, I felt a little dismay myself. Is this something that I really want to invest a lot of time in? There's also concerns about the costs involved, and especially from the Catholic worker point of view. Should not that money be used for the poor? A line that has scriptural reference. And Dorothy, again, that's something that would resonate with her priorities as well. So when I say that I do support this cause, and I've written about it, and I'm speaking about it tonight, it's not because I disrespect these very significant, conscientious questions that come from people I admire and people who know and honor and embody the spirit of Dorothy Day in many ways. So, following a little bit the structure of my article, for those of you who haven't read it, you can, if I leave anything out, you can, the article will fill it in. But I wanted to talk just a little bit about what saints meant to Dorothy Day, what I think saints mean to the Church, what would be the meaning for the Church of the canonization of Dorothy Day, a little bit about the politics of canonization, and address maybe a little more directly some of these concerns or sources of doubt that people might have about this. First, on the subject of Dorothy Day and saints. I think that any study of her writing or knowledge of her life, you are aware of how important saints were for Dorothy. Peter Morin basically gave her her Catholic education was by means of the saints. He said the saints are the ones who are the kind of true custodians and bearers of the Catholic tradition. And Dorothy, took that very much to heart. When Gordon Zahn, our great friend, Catholic pacifist, in the 1960s wrote to her and said that he was so disedified by the role of the bishops and not speaking out against the Vietnam War, Dorothy wrote him back and said, I have never really put all that much trust in the bishops, who often seem more concerned about power and prestige. You really have to look at the saints. They're the ones who kind of carry the true test of the gospel in their time. And they challenge us. The Catholic worker was illustrated, in the early days, almost entirely by images of saints. Adi Bethune's famous, pictures of the saints performing the works of mercy, or the works of peace, wearing kind of contemporary clothes. That was a reminder to the reader that what the Catholic worker was doing was rooted very much in the examples, the traditions of holiness and witness within the Church, and that saints were not people on a pedestal. They were people who in their own time were following the gospel mandate in a radical way in response to the challenges that they saw around them. Dorothy talked about saints all the time, and they were like members of her family. She also appealed to them as patrons. She prayed to St. Joseph and the patron of St. Joseph House, and whenever there were bills to be paid, she time to pick at St. Francis, she would say. She had a very deep sense that the saints were all around us in this cloud of witnesses, and that they were our helpers as well as models of inspiration for us, that we should learn, we shouldn't be familiar with their stories. She certainly was interested in their humanity. She often said that the way that we turn saints into kind of a saccharine, pious image does tremendous damage to the real function or the purpose of saints, which is not to be worshipped or idolized, but to inspire us and challenge us in our own call to holiness. And that, I think, was a movement that became clearer and clearer in the first 10 years or so of Dorothy's work in the Catholic Worker, from writing about the saints as inspirations and how much we can learn from them, to coming to this message that we are all called to be saints. So I'm not unhappy that Joanne chose that title for my lecture, because my article, because it does very much resonate with a deep message for Dorothy Day, that all are called to holiness, that is the vocation of the Christian. Now, that is not something she made up, nor is it something that that has been forgotten. In Vatican II, it talks about the universal vocation of holiness, that all people, by different means, whatever their station in life is, are called to be holy. And that did not mean to be called to be canonized, and it certainly did not mean to have, be in a stained glass window or a plaster statue of a saint. It meant the process of conversion, to constantly respond to the call to put off the old person and put on Christ. That's what it's really all about. And the ultimate aim of that is not to become some perfect person, some superhuman person, or some heavenly kind of a person, but to become our own best self transfigured by the example and the teachings and the Spirit of Christ. And to make that visible in the world, to sanctify the world through our own response to that call. And it's a radical call, because it doesn't just mean sanctify the world and to look like a church. To sanctify the world in the sense to better reflect the spirit of the kingdom of God, of the spirit of the Beatitudes, spirits of peace, of social justice, of community. So that theme runs so deep in the Catholic Worker tradition, the DNA of the Catholic Worker, that you can't really even take it out. Even if Dorothy had a very eclectic, kind of canon of saints that she appealed to, Dostoevsky and Kropotkin or whatever, but she kept coming back to traditional saints. Her favorite saint is about as traditional as you can get, Saint Therese of Lisieux. She spent many years trying to write a book about Therese. I'll say frankly, it's not her best book, and even the publisher rejected it, but it was eventually published. And it's not a great contribution to studies of Therese, but it reveals something about Dorothy's spirituality and gives you a clue about why Therese was so important. Because Therese was this Carmelite nun who died at a very young age, became famous through her posthumously published autobiography, which laid out a kind of science of holiness, a science of sanctification, how everyone could become a saint, as she had set out to do in her context. But it could be applied anywhere, and she called it the little way. And if you read her diaries, The Duty of Delight, or her letters, you see how much that spirit captivated her. The idea that wherever we happen to be, in our everyday, ordinary interactions with other people, this is an arena for holiness. If we offer every encounter, every sacrifice, every struggle we have, every challenge in our daily life, if we perform that and respond to it in love, it transforms our life into paradise. Dorothy definitely thought that Therese was kind of the people's saint, not because she was not canonized, but because she was a saint who spoke to everybody and was a great teacher, doctor of the church now, who taught the kind of the science, the method of how we could all do this. And it was deeply, again, absorbed by Dorothy in the kind of DNA that went into the Catholic worker, that sense of everyday sort of holiness. So no distinction there between holiness as something that belongs to these special few individuals, and then the rest of us who just shamble along and kind of do our best. There was continuity there between those great saints and all of us who are called to walk the path of holiness. Not to, again, to become another St. Therese or another St. Augustine or St. Dorothy, but to become our own true best self. So that's a little bit about the meaning of saints for Dorothy. What about the meaning of saints for the church? I think saints function as kind of mediating figures who show us in our own time how it is possible to live in a Christ-like way, or how to follow Christ in a radical way. And of course, the saints who are canonized, who go through that kind of process of certification, so to speak, represent only a very small number of the saints, the full number who known only to God alone. All kinds of people we meet who are saints all in our midst. But the church does select, certain people through a process who become authoritative models of some kind. I was just thinking today, I haven't actually written this before. I'm going to use it sometime in the future, so you're hearing it first. I think that if we talk of the church as a pilgrim people of God, the church as a community that's on a journey, and like any pilgrim or any person on a journey, carries a sort of a bag of resources for the trip. The things that they need to get them where they're going. And certainly for the church, that is the memory of Jesus as reflected in the scriptures, the traditions of the church, the teachings of the church, the liturgy and sacramental life of the church, but also the example and the witness of the saints. These are responded to that story and tried to reflect it faithfully, and therefore give us clues about how we might do that in our own time. Now, it becomes, if that's the case, it becomes quite important. Who are those saints that we remember, and how do we remember them? For a long time, in different points in the church's history, certain kinds of saints have predominated or have dominated within the memory or cult of the church. I mean, the martyrs, first of all in the early church, who went all the way and laying down their lives for the gospel. Then there were various kind of idealized, models of piety, the so-called, kind of virgin saints, the contemplatives, the monks, the mendicants, theologians. If, let's say, the main resource that you carry around in your little bag is Thomas Aquinas, that can be very helpful, if you're trying to understand conceptually the whole system of how faith and reason fit together and that sort of thing. But it can be a very distorting, view, or not very helpful in a lot of contexts about how we actually live our lives if all you're doing is carrying around Thomas Aquinas, or all you're carrying around is Perpetua and Felicity, or even St. Francis. And even if you're carrying around St. Francis, there's a whole question of how you remember him, and the need constantly to kind of refurbish or burnish that kind of memory so that we remember him as he was, his radical kind of message, and don't reduce him into some kind of pious, birdbath or St. Christopher medal or something like that, but that's something we carry around with us. Or the cross that becomes just a pious form of decorative, jewelry or something. And it's in that context that I think the importance of constantly adding to and supplementing and enlarging are the models, the resources of holiness that are available to the church. I think that, for that reason, Dorothy was thrilled that Therese of Lisieux was recognized as a saint, soon after her death. In a similar way, I take personally, and as my friends did, great excitement and satisfaction about the beatification of Franz Jägerstatter, the Austrian Catholic peasant who was beheaded by the Nazis for refusing to take an oath and serve in the German army, who died in a solitary witness. His story preserved by Gordon Zahn, whom I mentioned before, but who died and offered this witness with no assumption that anyone would ever hear about it, certainly not with any assumption that he would ever be raised to the altar of the church as a saint, but simply following the call of Christ as he experienced it in his context. For all the time that the option of a Franz Jägerstatter was considered kind of outside the church, it's an extreme kind of fanatical sort of thing to do, almost a kind of suicide, which is the way many of people that he consulted, his chaplains and even the bishop and everything, thought this is like throwing your life away to face execution like this, rather than serve in the army and maybe survive, or maybe not if you went to the Eastern Front. But still your duty was to your children, your family, your homeland, or whatever. And the big political issues about whether this was a satanic movement, committing war crimes, etc., genocide, that was not something that he had to worry about. And there was a whole period where there was a struggle for Catholic conscientious objectors to be recognized as having any legitimacy, because that kind of stand was, that's for Anabaptists or Quakers or something like that. It's not for Catholics. We follow a just war teaching, we obey authority and that sort of thing, and otherwise your job as a Catholic is to be a good Catholic, whatever, in a much narrower frame of reference. So to add Franz Jägerstatter as a saint, for him to be beatified, incidentally, by a pope from Germany, who took the oath that Jägerstatter was killed for refusing to take, is a great, more than an irony, but it's a sign of the fact that the church does grow in its moral imagination. Maybe not fast enough. Maybe not fast enough to preserve the human species in light of the threats that we are facing. And yet we need these resources in our little bag of we travel with, I think, who do enlarge that space. I think that Oscar Romero's beatification next month is another extraordinary occasion that fills me with a great deal of excitement, even though a lot of the same kinds of questions could be raised in sort of cynicism about that, why now, etc. I think it's quite significant that Romero has been recognized as a martyr. Now that might seem like, duh. A bishop is killed while saying mass, and by an assassin, by people who are motivated by hatred for the message of the gospel that he's proclaiming, the message of justice and solidarity and the poor. And yet there was a long, long time of decades where there was great discomfort about recognizing Romero as a martyr. Just as there was great discomfort in Austria and Germany for recognizing Jägerstatter as a martyr. Because if Jägerstatter is a saint, that implies that he did the right thing. And if what he did was the right thing, then that implies that all of the moral teaching of the church at that time had lost its compass somehow. Well, those are, we should not avoid asking questions like that just because they make us uncomfortable. In the same way with Romero, there was an effort to discomfort with calling him a martyr, because there was, there was a lot of people who said, well, he died because he got mixed up in politics. And if he just stuck with the gospel, just preached the gospel, this wouldn't have happened to him. So he's sort of asking for it in a way. They don't want to maybe go that far. Though some people will go that far. For instance, the United States ambassador to the United Nations, Jean Kirkpatrick, who, when talked about the 4 church women who were killed in El Salvador, said, well, you got to understand that these were not just nuns. These nuns were political activists on behalf of the Frente. And people who opposed the Frente, they killed them. And the idea was, well, it's too bad, but they were in the place where they shouldn't have been, sort of. So that's the kind of attitude that a lot of people had in resisting the canonization of Romero. and that if you beatified him, if you called him a saint, it would also empower and encourage all his radical followers and stuff, liberation theology, Church of the Poor and everything. They claim him as their hero, and they didn't want to do that. They didn't want to confront the idea that here a saint had died in El Salvador who had been abandoned, if not worse, by his brother bishops, and by Rome, even, you could say, left to that fate. He stood out there alone, a voice crying in the wilderness, and he was killed. Now, Pope Francis comes along and says he's a martyr. And this is a significant thing, because we might also have seen his canonization in a context, in a certain narrative, in which his death is not really a significant aspect in the whole story. What's really more important is he was very pious. He had connections with Opus Dei. He said the office every day. He was a very loyal and obedient bishop who had great devotion to the Blessed Mother and all that kind of stuff. And there was even a little revisionism going in there and kind of looking at his diaries and saying, see, he's not really political at all. He's really just a holy bishop, and he well deserves to be honored or something like that. Well, to call him a martyr is to first of all call out why he was killed and the relation between his death and his message. And to say he was killed out of hatred for the faith by people who called themselves Catholics, who called themselves defenders of the fatherland and of Christian civilization or whatever, and saying, BS. That is off the table. These people killed him because they hated the gospel which he was preaching, which he was representing in that context. And it is not only then, kind of calling out the hatred of the faith that Romero, led to his death, but it's also naming, I think, and calling out and proclaiming a love of the faith that he represented. And so in calling Romero a martyr, and in his canonization in that context, I think is a very, very significant step. And it means that when we put Romero in that little bag of tricks that we carry around with us, we carry the radical Romero, the Romero of the poor, the Romero of social justice, the voice of the voiceless, and not stripped of all of that radical message. And if you don't think that enlarges the moral imagination of the church and gives us a compass that helps us understand how to follow the way of Jesus in our time, I think that, I humbly disagree. In the same way, I think, in all cases, canonization, there's a kind of politics involved. There's a question of what is the message that is implied here. And altogether, too many saints who are canonized, I think they deliver the message that holiness is something that is done by nuns and foundresses of religious orders in Italy in the 19th century. All too many kind of examples of that. We have plenty of those kind of examples in our little bag of tricks. And it's meaningful to their congregations, perhaps, but not very much beyond that. I think, Dorothy Day, as somebody who was a lay person, very important thing to note, that here's a lay person, not a member of a religious order, congregation, who simply set about taking up the challenge, what is Christ calling us to do in our time? And she saw the needs around her, the depression, poverty, issue of social justice. It came out of her own radical background, those kind of thirst for how to connect her faith to those kind of questions. And the way she did that in the Catholic Worker, without asking for permission from the bishops, without getting a board of directors, without having some kind of clerical figurehead who would give her a little cover. Here's an unmarried mother, a recent convert, get no authorization, no permission from anybody, calls this the Catholic Worker and just sets about doing it. Well, partly because through Peter Morin, she was inspired by the examples of the saints who didn't necessarily ask for permission. They saw a need, they felt a call, they responded to it. So that is extremely significant. The fact that she is a woman, when the number of female saints is a small percentage of the overall number of canonized saints. Whatever the reasons are for that, you could speculate about. I think a very large part is that the whole process of canonization is entirely in the hands of men. And that goes not only to the selection of the saints to be canonized, but how they are to be interpreted, and how women's holiness is kind of shaped or interpreted in ways that don't challenge or upset the kind of patriarchy of the society or the church. Dorothy Day, as someone who did not kind of reflect the traditional sort of pious example of the holy woman, but who had a colorful, to say the least, past, tumultuous journey that had led to her conversion, and it made her then feel that she wasn't satisfied with just being a good Catholic, but she really felt called to go all the way, to take this utterly seriously. And then what she did with that, how she put together the practice of charity, the works of mercy, that are very traditional in the church, of course, with the struggle for justice. That was something really original. Other people you could point to in certain one way or another, but in Dorothy Day, that was quite an original conjunction. And it was rooted in an instinct in her own childhood, where she felt that there was a need for a different kind of saint, even long before she became a Catholic, but when she was attracted by hearing the stories of the saints. She said, it was edifying. I was moved to see all these stories of saints who cared for lepers and all that kind of stuff and sick. But where were the saints, she said, to change the social order? Not just to bind up the wounds of the slaves, but to do away with slavery. That was this radical challenge that she said, she wrote in her autobiography, but she's writing about her instincts as a child, that we needed a new kind of saint. Well, I would propose that Dorothy, her whole life was an answer to that question. Where are these saints to change the social order? Well, she set out to become one. And if Dorothy is made a saint, will in future have to wonder, future generations will not have to wonder, where are those saints? Here's one. Here's one who shows that it's possible. And if one person can do it, and of course many who followed her, then it's possible for everybody. We don't have to invent that. We still have to have the creativity and ingenuity to respond to the challenges of our own time, challenges that even Dorothy were not in her time or were not aware of. We don't emulate her in just fossilizing the three-point program of the Catholic Worker from 1933, but in following her as we do other saints, in seeing how they creatively and courageously responded to the challenges and the needs of their own time. That's the inspiration that she offers, as all saints do, I think, if we really look at their lives in context. I just say a little something about the context here. I said that a few years ago I was not all that excited when I heard the quality or the content of the kind of discussion of her canonization in the Bishop's Conference. And I thought, well, if this is what it's going to be, if we're just going to talk about what a holy person she was and how she might have even lived in our diocese, then do we really need that? I have to say that I have felt, as my whole attitude toward and hope for the Church has been rejuvenated and renewed in the era of Pope Francis. I have to say that even in the case of Dorothy Day's canonization, this provides a different kind of a context that inspires me a great deal. I thought to myself, if Dorothy could sort of imagine, she had a little daydream, a little reverie, imagining a pope, an ideal pope. I can't imagine how different, how he might very well resemble an Argentine Jesuit who had worked in the slums, who took the name of Francis, and in that name embodied a kind of an agenda for renewal of the church, to create a poor church for the poor, who spurned privilege and the trappings of power, to live in the guest house and carry his own bags and call people on the telephone and pay his own bills, etc., who would wash the feet of prisoners, including women and Muslims, who would go to the island of Lampedusa and cry over the loss of life there of refugees and decry the culture of indifference. who would connect the joy of the gospel with a prophetic critique of an idolatrous economy, who would intervene to help assist reconciliation between the U.S. and Cuba, who would hold a vigil all night to try to avert war in Syria, who would be working on an encyclical on ecology, all these kinds of ways. Now, I obviously am revealing my admiration for Pope Francis, and it is not to say that he is the savior or he is the one we've been waiting for, but I think of this, this context of a kind of program and vision of renewal of the church. A church going out of itself to reach out to those on the margins and the periphery, of a message of mercy, reconciliation, justice, peace, interfaith, dialogue, all these things, I think, is a remarkable context in which to be talking about the canonization of Dorothy Day. And it makes it clear that the point of this is not to honor Dorothy Day. It's not to bestow some kind of posthumous crown on her head, put her in the Catholic Hall of Fame or something like that. It is because she embodies a message and a vision that is in line with this possibility of renewal in the church, not just for the church's sake, but for the sake of a wounded world that needs that message of the gospel in its pure form so urgently. So I think that someone said to me, well, I think that Pope Francis is, his arrival is kind of blowing wind into the sails of this cause. And I said, I almost see it a different way. I see that the promotion of the cause of Dorothy Day is a way of empowering and supporting the promise of hope and renewal and change within the church, along the lines, not at the expense of what she really stood for, but in emphasizing what she did stand for. They're concerned for the poor, for social justice, for mercy. There's so many ways that you could say, look at how Dorothy Day anticipated the reforms of Vatican II, which shows that the deep changes do happen in the church. In some ways, the fact that we're talking about Dorothy Day today in her canonization is a sign of how far the church has come to kind of catch up with her message. But she still moves ahead. She still travels ahead of us, beckoning the church to follow on that path. And so she's not just a reference point that we carry in our little bag, looking backwards to the 1930s or 1980 or whatever. She still represents, I think, a call beckoning us to go farther. And I support the cause of her canonization because I believe that it holds the promise of keeping her memory alive and circulating it, not for the church of today, not just because there are lots of conferences about Dorothy Day today, but for the church of the future. And not only the church that will be, because inevitably there's always something there, but the church that might be. It is an anticipatory down payment, so to speak, a promissory note, as Martin Luther King liked to say, on a future that we wish for and that we believe in and that we want to make possible. And if I believe that the canonization of Dorothy will help that and will also awaken more people to the radical challenge of Jesus and the gospel, then I support it. And I do believe that, and that is why I do support it. Thank you very much. And now for the clarification of
Robert, thank you again. Would you address just a little bit, or explain to us the process of becoming a saint, the church's process?
Canonization is a church process. When we met with Cardinal O'Connor, he emphasized that point. He said, if we're not comfortable with that, then we have no business going forward. And that means it's a human institution as well as divine or whatever, that entrusted with this. Human beings with their own agendas and their own whatever, working together to try to do this in the right way. It begins in a local diocese where the saint lived, and it's now the local bishop introduces a cause or proposes it to Rome, where they conduct some preliminary review of what the kind of prima facie sort of case is, and then say yes or no. And if that's approved, then she, as occurred in this case, she becomes a servant of God, and then the diocese is responsible for initiating the diocesan phase, which is the collection of testimonies, the collection of the writings, and a biography of some kind. And it's a very bureaucratic kind of process. All has to be done according to the rules. And when that's all done, it's presented back to Rome. It's reviewed. They have to theologically review and assess all the writings and all this kind of stuff. And if it all then is accepted and approved, then the servant of God is declared venerable. Then the next step, another one then involves the certification of a miracle. In the case of a martyr like Romero, the miracle is waived, and they only need one more miracle to be canonized. Otherwise, it would be one miracle to be beatified, declared blessed, as has just happened with Romero, and then, not a miracle, but he was declared blessed. And then the next step would be, after a certification of another miracle, to be canonized and declared a saint of the Universal Church. That's the process. So we're at still, although this has been in process for a long time, we're still really at the very early stage of preparing the diocesan.
Thank you.
Yes?
I just was very moved by your connection with Dorothy and Oscar Romero, because it really speaks to me about, I had some dear friends who escaped the South American crises that were going on for Nicaragua and El Salvador and Mexico and all these places, Chile. And when they were exiles in New York and other areas of the United States, I heard about their struggles and heard the spiritual strength that they got. And one of the pieces that I learned about was comunidades de base, base communities, where they were not just talking about their community, they were praying and looking at the Bible in ways that connected with their people. And I feel Dorothy does that in a very similar way, so I really like that you made that connection. Yes, I definitely see.
Not here, but she was just pleased by the connections between Romero and Dorothy Day, and the inspiration of the base communities in the 1970s and 80s. Yes?
Have there been any miracles attributed to Dorothy?
Well, attributed and certified are different things. And I can't speak exactly to this, but there's a guy named David Mueller in the Midwest who also has a website and a network that he's been on his own developed to promote awareness of Dorothy Day. And he has been collecting many stories, which then are forwarded to the Dorothy Day Guild. They would have to be investigated, and the standards for authorizing that or recognizing that are very stringent, and I don't know the details exactly. Yes?
I mean, just to follow up on that, you say there are guidelines. What's a miracle?
It's interesting. Anybody really interested in the process of making saints, I recommend, it's been a few years now, but it's still a very good book by Ken Woodward called Making Saints. And he goes through all of this and how, under John Paul II, in many ways, the process was streamlined and reorganized, and it moves along, as we've seen recently, quite quickly in some cases and very slowly in others. But it still remains a part of the whole process. That the idea that this servant of God, this holy person, as kind of a test of the authenticity of their holiness, that their intercession to them, prayers to them, can yield, benefits to those who invoke them. Now, there are all kinds of, you could talk all night on that subject alone, what that really means. Because how do you measure that? Well, you have to be able to rule out that there were no other causes, that there was no natural explanation. And how do we do that in the case of the fact that the Star Wars missiles never actually worked or something like that? How do you reckon that in with the fact that for whatever 60 years or whatever of the nuclear age, we have still not had another nuclear bombing since 1945. Those are things that can give all kinds of political explanations or whatever. So it really comes down to the certificate in practice, a recognition of a medical cure that has to be directly attributable to the intervention of the saints. So, and this is also, I've always wondered about this, about the people who have the faith to pray to somebody who doesn't have any track record. It's one thing to pray to St. Jude or something like that, but Bernadette of Lourdes or whatever, Padre Pio would be my first bet. And how to pray for some bishop or some nun or something like that so it's a great act of faith, and it has to be a serious. It's not that I had psoriasis and it all cleared up or something. It has to be something that very serious, and the cure has to be long-standing. Not I had a remission for 6 months and then I died or whatever, but it has to be quite sudden and dramatic.
But the miracles are all healing of physical.
So in practice, I'm not sure whether there has ever been a recognized miracle, at least in modern times, that was not medical. Now the issue of that, of course, as medical knowledge advances, there are things in the past that might have been considered miracles, and now we can. And it's also the fact that it's very difficult to tell whether how can you if they were undergoing some kind of medical treatment, how can you be sure that that didn't have something to do with it? Well, it comes down. So then it really comes down to the testimony a lot of doctors. Become the kind of hold in their hands the key to canonization, because it has to be somebody who's disinterested in somewhere, a woman of science or something who is not credulous, who says, I have no explanation for this other than, I have no explanation, and that's what they want to hear. So the amazing thing is that you might say, well, in our modern age that doesn't happen anymore or something like that, but yet it does. Edith Stein, John Paul II, John the 20th, all these people you point to, except for the martyrs, somewhere along the line a miracle was recognized. How about somebody in the back? Yeah?
What did you think of JP2's canonization, John Paul II?
I have, it's easier for me to recognize that he was a very holy man, personally speaking, than it is for me to recognize that he was a very great pope. And those are, I think different questions. History can judge what his impact or legacy is for the church, but I don't really doubt that he was an extraordinary apostle, and whether I agree with all of his policies or what his legacy is, what I did find. What bothers me more is, the sort of cult of personality a little bit, and the idea that, that here's this pope who's been there for decades, and the moment he dies, a cry goes up, sainthood now, and his predecessor. It's sort of a funny precedent for your successor to then begin the cause of your canonization and to press it through with extreme haste, to kind of set the rules aside. So again, John Paul II was a great one for naming saints. He had it was almost, he was on a mission to name as many saints as possible, maybe 1,000 or more in his time, more than all of previous history practically put together. So it was, if for nothing else, I guess,
I guess what sticks in my throat all the time is the pedophilia.
Of course, yeah. And so again, the question is, mean, that to me goes to the question of why perhaps greater time should pass, and instead of in a rush of maybe sentimentality or popularity kind of contest, rushing to proclaim someone a saint, when it takes a while for history and the church to kind of take the measure of what their legacy was. Thank goodness we didn't do that with Pius XII, the moment he died or something. I think it took a while for some questions to be raised about what are the politics of that, in the sense of not power politics, but what is the message? Because naming someone a saint, it doesn't mean that now John Paul II was in some kind of pope limbo and now he's in sitting at the right hand of God. He's wherever his soul was destined title to be. So it's only a statement for the church, really, and how we, and a kind of self-understanding in the light of the witness that that person offers. And I do think there's a wisdom in waiting a bit. I don't know when Benedict dies whether there'll be immediate call for, he's sort of a little out of sight, out of mind maybe, but it was a very dramatic thing with this long kind of Calvary that John Paul II endured, with Parkinson's and everything. And many, extraordinary moments of his life, the assassination attempt and how he went to forgive his assailant and that sort of thing. Things that will be remembered, I think, as extraordinary gestures, and a person who left a mighty big impress on the church. Entirely for good, I can't answer that. Yes?
Thank you very much. You had a chance to take a look at the David Brooks' new book.
Funny you should mention that. I have it in my bag. David Brooks, the conservative columnist for the New York Times, op-ed columnist, has been writing some interesting essays over the last year, I've noticed, on values and kind of on character and the the kind of living out of our deepest selves and the kind of soul of daily life. And I actually wrote him a letter. I said, Mr. Brooks, I don't always agree with your political issues, but I was very moved by this, in fact, because he had mentioned Dorothy Day. So I wrote to him and sent him a book that I had written and got a nice response back. So I got the book, and I was very surprised to discover it has a whole chapter on Dorothy Day. I haven't read it yet, so I'm not going to certify and say about that, but I'm sure, like everybody's picture of Dorothy Day, it says as much about them as it does about her. But it was significant to me that someone like that would also be entering into this conversation. Jane, you want to comment?
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. One thing, I know when you said this thing about Archbishop Romero, yes, he was abandoned by the Bishops' Conference, which for the most part just found him very distasteful, except for one, and I think it's always important to remember that one member of a 6-member Bishops' Conference did not abandon him, and in fact was his greatest supporter.
Talking about Rivera Adames?
Arturo Rivera Adames, who died in '94 after hoping to engineer the peace process in '92. He died in '94, and I just feel great respect and honor that he be remembered for his great love and camaraderie in a very distasteful sort of bishops' conference where one was an admiral or a general or And then the other thing, just to say, Therese got canonized not right away.
Well, 20 years after.
How much?
20 years later.
Yeah, well, she was canonized in 1925.
Do you think that it took
Less than 30 years.
Took Joan of Arc 500 years?
Yeah, but it wasn't just
Dorothy has been now 35 years.
Wasn't John Paul II's speed?
No, he didn't set any records.
John Paul
I think that belongs to Blessed Jose Maria Echeverria. Yes?
You're making a list of the present. How many on that list would have radical political convictions? Would she be a rarity, or would you have others?
Well, there are many figures who stood up for the workers' rights and things like that, especially the time after Pope Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum, who took up that kind of banner. There were saints who were supported the cause of Italian reunification at a time when that was considered heretical. There are people like John Henry Newman, who was a great champion of conscience and that sort of thing. There are saints who were and figures maybe not canonized, but figures like Bartolome de las Casas, kind of prophetic Dominican, who was a champion of the Indians and poor, that sort of thing. So you can, but I think the idea of the kind of it takes sort of the modern era when we have more of a kind of a understanding of sociology and social movements, and the idea of that you perhaps the way to express charity is not just by helping a poor person, but by changing the structures that create so much poverty. So Dorothy came out of a context of radical social movements, and she brought that with her. She found other labor priests and people at the time who were sympathetic to that message, but I don't think, went nearly as far and didn't join it with the radical peace message that she embodied. So I think you can find a community of people who are certainly her comrades, but I think she really did represent something quite original in the annals of holiness.
On the list of saints who argued for Canonization Society.
Well, I mean, again, it depends what you mean by that. I mean, Pope John the 23rd has been beatified, and he, certainly had a vision of creating a just social order and that sort of thing. But again, the activism that Dorothy had no embarrassment about aligning herself with other social radicals who were trying to work for civil rights or labor unions or social movements and that sort of thing, anti-racism or whatever. That she is a very modern person in that sense.
You want to know me, or?
I can't be held accountable to whether there anybody else, but I just say I think that she represents something new. There are people that have a family resemblance to her, but I think she would definitely stand out. I mean, unless now we're going to have Blessed Oscar Romero as the character. Julie?
Oh yeah. I hate to bring this up, but one person who's evidently on the road to canonization, and I guess I heard that maybe Pope Francis will announce it while he's here, is Junipero Serra.
Yes.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're supposed to. I mean, I don't know.
It's
I mean, just with the checkered history.
No, there are. Someone just sent me a very interesting book proposal. I didn't accept it, but it was a critique of St. Peter Claver, who was a Jesuit in Cartagena, I guess, at the time, in the New World when slave ships were coming. And he was declared a patron saint of social justice. And he is usually portrayed as somebody who is a great advocate and defender of the slaves, etc.
Well, like Sister Peter Claver.
Yeah, Peter Claver. But this was a book that was very interesting, a critique of that, and saying that in a way that the church has not really addressed its compromise with white supremacy, and that his record is actually much more ambiguous about, he cared for slaves and everything, but was he really confronting or challenging the system of slavery in any way? You can, it's a question of, when someone is canonized, does that mean that we agree with everything they did? And because a lot of people then would protest very much about Dorothy Day, because they say, well, I disagree with, she didn't pay taxes, or she went to Cuba, or whatever, people say these things. And I think that I'm not going to comment on the legitimacy of any particular person like that. That's obviously a cause that has been in process for a long time. with its advocates and then also its critics. There's often, again, it's there are political considerations, and I don't know to what extent those kinds of questions were taken seriously or taken into account. I would have liked to have seen Bartolomé de las Casas canonized, sooner. Should we take maybe one more? I don't know how the time is. Well, got one and two. Okay, how about you?
Yeah, I remember sainthood meeting something very miraculous when I was young and Catholic. I was wondering, some years ago, why all the sainthood was taken away from a lot of these characters.
You're talking about, well, there were a number of names that were removed in the revision of the calendar of saints because there was no reason to believe that they ever existed, for instance, and that has to be one of the the minimal kind of requirements maybe for. But it's interesting because then what do you do about someone like Joan of Arc who died, refusing to disavow the voices that spoke to her, that included, Catherine of Siena, Catherine of Alexandria, who, most certainly never really existed, and yet was one of the most influential, saints, patrons of all kinds of countries and classes of people and that sort of thing. So sometimes, I think that, it's Karl Barth, the great Reformed theologian, was asked one time, do you really believe that a snake spoke to Adam and Eve? And he said, well, it's not important whether or not a snake spoke to Adam and Eve. What's important is what he said. I think that is also carries over in some ways to some of the annals of the saints. Did Saint Christopher really exist? Did Saint George really slay a dragon? Did Sister Saint Catherine of Alexandria convert all of the Pharaoh's court or whatever? But there are we carry these stories with us, not because of their historicity, but because of what they say to us, what the message is. So I'm not so concerned about purging the list of saints. I'm more concerned about holding on to the authentic story, the authentic gospel that comes to us, speaks to us through these stories. Maybe there's just one more, I guess, in the back.
I was just wondering, I know you mentioned in your article, that people think she's this and that. Is there anything that the church is looking at that they're concerned about with her life? I know you mentioned that different Catholic workers throughout the country may be saying
that's a different matter. But what would be things? Well, I'll just speak to one thing, because certainly there were people who said, how could Dorothy Day be a saint? She had an abortion. And for a long time, that was a thing that would come up a lot. She could never be a saint because she had an abortion. Well, that shows, really not understanding of the church's understanding of the call to conversion, and that no one is held, accountable for the things that they did, that they repented of, or that were their past. I think that what was more of concern to me was not so much that would be a discrediting item, as that it would be kind of latched onto as a central focus of her narrative. In, let's say, if Dorothy Day is presented as a great sinner who became a great saint, then they point at the story of her abortion, which she never wrote about, never discussed, nobody really hardly knew about that while she was alive, and make that like the critical, point of her biography. Whereas if you, I think, look at her life and you read her autobiography and everything she wrote, that was, among a number of things in her early life that led on the path to her conversion. But the catalyst was not regret for her sins or her past, but gratitude for the gift of life and the birth of her daughter and her experience of natural happiness. She writes of it's the whole centerpiece of the autobiography, as opposed to an episode or story that's not even mentioned. Whether she, because how it weighed on her and her memory, that's another matter. But it was not part of the story that she felt was critical. And so I think that the crucial thing about Dorothy Day, is then in their autobiography how she describes her prayer in the Basilica of the Immaculate Conception for some way to connect her commitment to social justice and her faith. And she did that in the Catholic Worker. And that's what her life is about. And if her life is turned into a parable about how even someone who, has, tragedy or sadness or sin in their past or whatever can still become a great saint, well, that is reducing her very much and doing exactly, I think, the injustice to her memory that arouses people's concerns about what happens when the bishops or the church or whatever gets a hold of this story. It falls on us to then say, okay, well, then we're not going to have anything to do with I'm speaking personally, I'll have nothing to do with the canonization in that case, but to continuously, tell the whole story the way I think it should be told. So it's a challenge, to keep that full history and that challenge along. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thanks, Robert, and we have lots of goodies downstairs, so we can